is like the end of all these this period coming together, and the annual celebration of Luang Por Chah on his death day, funeral day. Next year it'll be 20 years since he died in 1992, and it'll be 2012, and it's predicted by the Mayan calendar that the world's going to end before. No, it'll be after the Ngan, won't it? I don't think you're taking this seriously. But Ajahn Chah's always saying the world ended here, pointing to his citta, and say that we want to see the end of the world, and the world ends here. So that's something worth contemplating. What does he mean by that? And then contemplate, what do you mean by the world? I found this, this kind of challenging, because we think we know the word, we think we know what it means, and of course, in my background, the world always meant a physical world. The end of the world meant like Armageddon, where everything disappears into a void or whatever. But in Dhamma practice, you're not looking on that scale, on the macrocosmic view. You're looking from the microcosm of the world that we create. Who's the creator of the world? Did God create the world? And then these are like rhetorical questions, ways of asking yourself, to investigate, to find out how to use not just see things in such kind of standard, physical, culturally prejudiced ways, but by what is the world, and then in Buddhism that's the illusions we create in our mind. So, each one of us lives in our own world. We all think we live in the same world, but when you really get to know others, listen to them, and when you're like a Jawa Wat, the Wat Banana Chat, like Ajahn Kevali, you think you're all on the same plane, but you're not. Each one is living in his own world. So, and that's why it's so frustrating, because you think, what's wrong? What's the matter? Why can't they? And then eventually, by contemplating this, you realize it's the way things are. And we have to experience life from this point. That's a human birth, and so you're kind of incarcerated in the human form for a lifetime, and then it's conditioned when you're born, by your mother, father, society, and all the rest. So you get your messages through your family, especially first is your mother and father, your brothers, sisters, relatives, and cultural conditioning, social identities, and all the rest come after you're born. You aren't born with a personality, or you're not born as anything other than a human form that's conscious. And then the conditioning starts after you're born. So like in the first three fetters, the sanyojanas, the first three are the creations out of ignorance, cultural conditioning, the self-view, and the thinking process. Even the language we have, that we learn from our parents, from our culture, is conditioned out of ignorance. It's not to be just taken for granted and operate from just the way one thinks with one's native tongue. And so like this mindfulness wisdom practice of the Buddha is it gets you to have perspective on just the conditions that you've acquired, from both, from education, from cultural identities, and your own identity with what you look like, and the ego, the sense of your individuality and self that is developed after you're born. So this is the world, and we wonder why we have problems with getting on with others is because when we're trying to compare one person with another, we usually using ourselves as the kind of precedent, and then they don't quite fit into the world that I conceive of. and then misunderstandings, problems arise. So in this practice, mindfulness, then this is a way. This is the only way, the only possible way one can get out of the trap of samsara, of the conditioned realm. It's the only possible way when you see it yourself. You don't believe me, but just investigate. Because no matter how refined your conditioning might be, it's still anicca dukkha anatta. Not to mention, from the coarse level to the very subtle or refined levels, these are conditioned. So they have only a span. They are born and die. So then, mindfulness is that way that a human individual has to have perspective on birth and death. And so they call it the deathless. I named the monastery in England Amaravati, Deathless Realm, because, and this was we went there in 1984, and at that time in Europe there was a Britain, probably in Germany too, against these cruise missiles, and it's almost taken for granted that this war was inevitable. And so, but there was talk of nothing at the time in the society in the Britain that I lived in at that time. It was like, it's all about, we're going to die anyway, what's the point, the Third World War, all about death. And that whole concept of the deathless was not consciously felt, in the society. It was all about death. And so I intentionally named this monastery in Hertfordshire, Amaravati, Deathless Realm, just to be able to use the term, to at least stimulate some kind of questioning, rather than this fatalistic, negative attitude that was so commonly felt. And then, of course, the Soviet Union imploded, and the Berlin Wall suddenly disappeared. I remember when I first heard news of the Berlin Wall being demolished, because a week before they started tearing down the Berlin Wall, I was talking to one of the German monks in England, and so I asked him, I said, do you think they'll ever tear down that wall? And he said, not in our lifetime, never. And he was considerably younger than I. And and then the week later, they're tearing it down. so that was, and then the Soviet Union imploded, this kind of monolithic menace that in America, you're conditioned to see the Soviet Union as this kind of invincible, ongoing disease that's taking over the planet, like a crawling fungus that you just have to keep at bay as best you can, and then suddenly it implodes. It wasn't just, a war and a revolution even, it just kind of failed. And that was something no one expected at all. So, but this is talking like this is a way of showing how world events, why we want to have the security of being tell the future and know what's going to happen in the future. But Ajahn Chah was always this Maya practice was uncertain, because right now you're sitting here. At this moment you're sitting in this sala, Vatnanachat, and the future, right now, what is the future could be anything. Anything you imagine might happen in the future. And this you can know, what you don't know is in the future. And then the past is what you remember. I remember yesterday, and so for the meeting at Wat Bapong. And that's the past. But there's only this here and now moment. And this is where Sati Sampajanya is. It's our escape hatch from birth and death. So this is like this escape hatch is just being able to be fully present in the moment, and not through controlling or manipulating your mind, but through releasing any controls and kind of opening widely to the present, but also being aware of it. So it's not the kind of seeing only from the position of knowing, rather than from your own personal feeling of the moment, or your cultural attitude about it, or your personal opinion. So this kind of reflection is, the way out of suffering, and put it back in the context of Four Noble Truths, is mindfulness that allows us to get perspective on the worlds we create, on the illusions that we have about ourselves and the world and other people. There's no other way we can do it. Trying to control the world from our world always leads to disaster. As if you read history, you can see, it's a history of disasters, of people, trying to control everybody, usually through tyrannical or oppressive means or whatnot, to try to make them all march in step or fit into a context of somebody's ideal, some philosophical, religious, or political ideal. And of course, in our lifetime, we've seen that the failure of Soviet communism. It was an ideal based on very high-minded perceptions of equality and fairness, and where there's no rich and no poor, and it's all the very best. And the ideal was very beautiful, but the means used to promote the ideal was a tyrannical one. So can you get a perfect communist society through tyranny? And of course, look what happened. And then society, the world, we're never going to live in the same world. Monks I've known all these years, we don't just have the same thoughts, same tendencies, same, attitudes about things. We all still have these differences. But the aim is to see the world rather than believe in our own separate world and operate from our own particular personal agendas or views or attitudes or reactions. So that you can see the profundity of this teaching, but it is a practical teaching. It's not just being philosophical or abstract about it. It's when the Buddha pointed to suffering as the first noble truth, he pointed at something quite ordinary. It's not subtle or abstruse or refined. It's just ordinary feeling of dis-ease or unhappiness or doubt or worry. Is that so? When you have the noble truth based on such an ordinary, common human experience, that's significant. That's the kind of key, the clue to the escape from suffering. And that whole sequence of the noble truth then follows accordingly, gives you the directions, information you need. But the bhatibhata, the practice, is internalizing that, making it work for you, because nobody can do it for you. Not even an enlightened Buddha could make his disciples enlightened. But he could give these expedient teachings to give that direction in which enlightenment are seen clearly. And then the worlds, the different worlds, are no longer like here in this tradition. We all agree, in terms of structure of living together, we have the Vinaya. So that gives us structure and agreement about behavior and etiquette, which we all agree to. So we're all from different backgrounds. We all live in our own worlds, but we agree to live with this structure. In that way, we aren't endlessly kind of, forcing our opinions and our views onto each other. We're not trying to use power and force and fear and tyranny in our lives. But to become a bhikkhu, you have to agree to live within the boundaries of the Vinaya, learn that, so that it becomes like something that is quite natural for you. When you first ordain, Vinaya can seem very clumsy and problematic, because when you start anything, learning to play the guitar or learn to play a sport or a dance step or something, you have to start out being quite clumsy and until you develop the skill. So this is like a training to not to be grasping, but not to just institutionalize you and make you conform, but to give you an expedient lifestyle that we can get perspective on what's really important. It's here, the mind itself, observing the feelings, the thoughts, the emotions that one has in terms of Dhamma rather than in terms of right, wrong, good or bad, and personal identities. So, leave you with this, and I found, this way, it does take persistence, because, there's so many distractions, and one goes through various phases of love and hate with the tradition, and doubts and faith and so forth. So, it isn't that I'm totally committed to Thai forest tradition right from the start and never questioned it, but, I did have enough faith in it to use it and learn how to use it, and then to see my own personal world and emotional habits in regards to limitation on action and speech and structures, conventional structures, and being a Buddhist monk, I lived 34 years in the UK, so you're kind of on the fringe of society. Here you're everybody goes like this, going to that ngan and all those 1,000 people going like this to us. And when you go to Europe, you don't get that kind of treatment. But the practice is still the same, whether you're here in Thailand or in England. Is that you keep your attention here. You're not looking for to try to make problems around the society you're in, but to use the society you're in to observe your own emotional reactions, love, hate, like, dislike, and how the self manifests in this life. Your own feeling, your own sense of your individuality is not to suppress or deny, but to recognize. So this satipanya is a way of recognizing the way things are. It's not about trying to make things the way you want or to make things fit an ideal that you have, but to be able to trust this ability to recognize Dhamma, know Dhamma in a direct way, not through conceiving it, but recognizing it and trusting it. So I offer this as a reflection.